At night, Subura smelled of vinegar, smoke, and human sweat. Streams of sewage flowed from under the arches, mixing with wine spilled on the ground. Women in tunics stretched to the elbows sat at the doors of houses. Some counted coins, others scraped paint off their skin, which they had used during the day to mask their fatigue. At dawn, it was not a client who awaited them, but a collector, a man in a dust-colored cloak, who had come to demand taxes from those whom the law itself had declared shameful. Good evening. You are watching a chronicle about Rome, a city where morality and budget shared the same walls. I am your narrator. Write in the comments where you are watching from. Which country? Which city? Now make yourself comfortable. The story will be unpleasant, but true. Enjoy listening. From the beginning of Tiberius's reign, taxation of prostitutes became part of the imperial budget. A law called Vectigul ex capturis required all those who sold their bodies to pay a tax equal to 20% of their annual income. The state called this a contribution to moral order. If vice cannot be eradicated, it must be taken into account in the accounts. Women who decided to work openly had to register with the aediles, the city officials who supervised markets, baths, and houses of pleasure. The imperial treasury saw such women as a source of stable income, just like sellers of oil or wine. The courtesan in question lived in the upper tiers of Subura, where the houses swayed under their own weight. Her name has not been preserved in the documents, only an entry in the table of fines. Libertina, Vectigul duplex, a freedwoman subject to double taxation. She had already paid the tax, but the collector demanded a second payment under the guise of a fine for debauchery. This gave rise to a contradiction that accidentally revealed the mechanism of double enrichment of local officials. In Rome, everything was taxed, from salt to urine, which was collected at tanneries. Morality served as a cover for accounting. The Senate approved resolutions on moral purity, but below, officials turned them into tariffs. Courtesans, registered as meretrices licitae, had the right to work without fear of punishment if they kept records of their income and did not hide their clients. However, the same department that accepted their contributions issued fines as if they were breaking the law. The lawyer the woman turned to was a minor attorney at the Temple of Ceres. He found a discrepancy between the tax tables and the code of penalties. The list of fines for debauchery did not include the names of those who had already paid the Vectigul. It turned out that the collector had applied one article to those who had already fulfilled another. This gave rise to the idea of filing a complaint, not about morality, but about double taxation. In those years, judicial practice depended on patrons. Every lawyer needed a patron, a senator or magistrate willing to support the case. But interfering with taxes was considered risky. Even by accusing the tax collector, you were indirectly affecting the treasury. Nevertheless, the lawyer filed a petition with the municipal court, citing the principle of non bis in idem. No one can be punished twice for the same offense. This Latin aphorism existed long before Christian morality, but it was rarely applied in Rome, especially to women of low status. While the case was being heard, the collector continued to roam the streets. He raised the rates, demanding compensation for insulting the authorities. Records preserved in the archives of the Campidoglio show an increase in fees during those years, almost a third in one season. The legal system became a means of profiteering. Anyone could be charged and then offered a peaceful settlement. A woman who decided to challenge a fine risked everything. Without a license, she could be expelled from the city. With a license, she could become an example to intimidate others. At night, men from the city guard appeared under the windows of her house, making noise and throwing stones, pretending to be public outrage. Formally, This was not considered persecution. Everything was done at the will of the crowd. The lawyer gathered evidence, copies of statements, records of previous payments, and the testimony of 2 witnesses, slaves who submitted income reports. They showed that the collector had demanded the same amount twice, only changing the name of the tax. The first receipt said Vectigal, the second, Poena Luxuriae. Both documents were signed by the same hand. Meanwhile, the Senate was discussing a new decree on the moral purification of the city. Under this pretext, they wanted to increase the share of the pleasure tax. The senators cited a threat to demographics. Freedwomen allegedly distracted men from marriage. But in reality, as historian Suetonius notes, the law was needed to replenish the treasury after an expensive festival in honor of Jupiter. The trial began quietly. Only 3 people attended the hearings: the quaestor, the secretary, and the clerk. The minutes contain the following note: the case of double taxation of freedwomen, evidence of tariff inconsistency presented. Formally, it was a minor dispute over taxes, but behind it lay a question that touched on the very structure of power. Could an official increase the treasury at his own discretion? When the lawyer presented the documents, it became clear that the tax collector had indeed changed the rates by hand. In the table posted on the forum, the tariff was one, and in the copies it was another. The clerk noticed the difference in the numbers and marked it with a red line. The percentage of personal withholding exceeds the norm. It was this point that became the turning point. Now it was no longer about the woman, but about the system. Subsequent events showed how easily the Roman concept of morality was turned into a tool for extortion. After the woman's complaint, other courtesans began to bring in their receipts. The amounts varied, but the signature was the same. The city began to talk about a tax on shame that fed not the gods, but the middlemen. Temple officials began an investigation and uncovered the collector's connection to the villa of one of the senators, where he kept part of the collected money under the guise of donations. But before the scheme collapsed, there were several weeks of humiliation and threats. The woman lived in fear of being accused of slander. She continued to pay rent as if nothing was happening, and only her lawyer remained by her side. Later, he would write in his notes, "All Roman law began with one woman's decision not to pay twice." The investigation quickly went beyond the small courtroom. The archivist who checked the receipts noticed a strange coincidence. Almost all the documents with inflated rates passed through the same place, a private villa on the slope of the Esquiline Hill. Formally, it stored lists of taxes and a log of donations to temples. In reality, the villa belonged to the collector's patron, a former quaestor, whose family was involved in the leasing of state taxes. This was a common practice. The wealthy bought the right to collect taxes from the treasury in order to receive interest on them later. Thus, moral penalties became a regular business. The courtesan, whose complaint started it all, did not know she was being watched. After the hearing, she was summoned for questioning by the praetor, no longer as a victim, but as a possible participant in document forgery. In those days, a charge of forgery was considered almost a death sentence. But the praetor limited himself to questions about the origin of the money and who was helping her. The lawyer was not allowed to attend the interview. The clerk, who drew up the minutes later, recalled that the woman spoke calmly, even though she understood that every word could be used against her. Meanwhile, a rumor spread among the city guards that a purge of vice was being prepared in Subura. This expression concealed a wave of arrests, formally to strengthen morals, but in fact to intimidate those who argued with the tax system. Several women disappeared after night raids. Their names never appeared on any list of detainees. There was talk that some of them had been sold in the provinces as stateless slaves. The lawyer realized that the case was out of control. He turned to an old law professor who had once served in the chancellery of Emperor Augustus. The latter confirmed that the pleasure tax had always been considered special, and that interference with it was perceived as an attack on imperial revenues. But he also reminded him that Rome was held together not only by orders, but also by form. If you could prove that the figures had been falsified, you could defeat even those who stood above the law. He suggested looking for documents in the archives of the Temple of Juno Moneta, where duplicates of all the city's financial reports were kept. They managed to get there only thanks to their acquaintance with one of the scribes. In the dusty tablets, they found what they were looking for: copies of the tariffs approved by the Senate 3 years before the scandal. In them, the tax rate for meretrices was specified once and was not subject to doubling. Moreover, at the bottom was an order to consider any charges above the norm illegal. This became key evidence, but it was almost impossible to bring it to court. Every official who received a copy stalled for time. Some cited the lack of a seal, others demanded payment for verification. The document seemed to be sinking into a bureaucratic quagmire. Then the lawyer decided to act publicly. He appealed to the Temple of Vesta, where priestesses had the right to appeal directly to the Senate if it was a matter of a violation of the vow of justice. It was risky, because a woman who challenged the tax was considered defiled. But that was precisely the power of this step: to oppose bureaucratic hypocrisy with a symbol of purity. The priestesses did not accept the petition in person, but allowed the scroll to be left at the gate. A few days later, a discussion began in the Senate. Who had allowed the collectors to change the rates without the approval of the Treasury? Those present spoke cautiously. One senator noted that the issue of double taxation could cause unrest among artisans, since many taxes were collected using the same scheme. Another suggested hushing up the story so as not to undermine the authority of the law. But copies had already begun to circulate in the forum. Sources from that time mentioned that scrolls with tables were even read in bathhouses. People discussed the amounts and compared their receipts. Thus, for the first time in Roman history, a conversation about morality became a conversation about tariffs. Ordinary citizens understood that the louder the authorities spoke about morality, the higher the fees would rise. The patron, the owner of the villa, tried to intervene. He sent gifts to the praetor and offered to settle the conflict. In return, he demanded that the complaint be withdrawn. But the woman refused, even though she understood that her life would change after that. When rumors of bribery reached the Senate, an internal investigation began. Accounting books were found in the villa, containing hundreds of names with notes about personal deductions next to them. One of the scribes working at the villa confessed. He said that the collector brought money every month and received instructions on which receipts to correct. These corrections were covered up with the slogan of protecting good morals. Each new rate was justified by the fact that debauchery is on the rise. In reality, these were ordinary interest rates. The Senate could not turn a blind eye. There were too many witnesses. The leak was too obvious. Then the priests of Saturn, the guardians of the city treasury, intervened. They insisted that all receipts from recent years be checked against the originals. The audit lasted more than a month. The result was shocking. Almost every 10th entry contained traces of forgery. When this was reported to the emperor, he ordered a purge of the tax department. This is how the chronicles referred to the mass dismissal and arrest of several officials. Patron was not formally touched. His family had too many connections. But the villa was sealed, and the tax collector was sent into exile in Libya. The woman who started it all received written confirmation. The fine was canceled, and the amounts paid were returned. For Rome, this was a significant event, recognition that the law could protect even those who were considered immoral. But the victory was a bitter one. After the trial, her house was set on fire. No one was hurt, but the message was clear. In Rome, you can't beat the system twice. A lawyer wrote in his diary that from that day on, tax collection was handled differently. Each receipt now required the signatures of two officials. This is how the rule of double confirmation appeared in imperial law, later spreading to other areas. But behind this dry legal fact was a human story, a woman who was tired of paying for someone else's greed. The city did not change immediately after the scandal. The streets still smelled of sour wine and torch resin. But in the forums, people talked about tables, not prophecies. The case of the freedwoman became a parable, not about morality, but about bureaucracy. For the first time, people understood that morality in Rome could be measured in numbers and added to the treasury. The emperor, trying to calm society, instructed the praetor Claudius Saturninus to draw up a new set of rules for meretrices. The document was called De Officiis Pudicitiae, on the duties of chastity. It did not contain a word about morality, only the structure of tax groups. Women were divided according to income, place of residence, and class of clients. In this way, the authorities attempted to regain control by turning vice into a manageable economic category. Anything that could not be controlled was declared a sin. Temples were given the right to collect part of the fees for the purification of souls. Thus began the era of moral funds, where piety became a budget item. Not only tax collectors, but also priests, now participated in the bidding for licenses. They convinced the people that by paying taxes, the city was atoning for its own sins. A lawyer involved in the case observed this with bitter irony. He wrote that the state is learning to profit from shame. Because of the new rules, women had to wear special marks, copper rings engraved with their license number. Losing the ring was considered a violation and resulted in a fine. Thus, the control system extended not only to money, but also to bodies. For the residents of Subura, this became a trap. On the one hand, registration provided protection from the arbitrariness of the guards. On the other hand, it turned women into objects of constant surveillance. Each tax collector now carried a list of names linked to neighborhoods. Any discrepancy between income and payment was interpreted as fraud. Tax became a tool of surveillance. The patron, whose name people tried not to mention, continued to influence affairs through intermediaries. His villa was sealed, but the land remained with the family. He did not suffer seriously. In Rome, corruption was considered part of nature. The Senate did not want to raise the old case so as not to show the weakness of the authorities. Only in the chronicles of the temples did a few words sometimes appear. The damage was recovered in the case of double taxation, but the shame remained. Gradually, the city got used to the new order. Courtesans paid taxes again, but now the amounts were fixed openly. It would seem that justice had been restored. However, now the fees did not go directly to the treasury, but through special temple cash desks. Thus, officials found a new way to make a profit, with the help of sacrificial intermediaries. Between the lines of the chroniclers, one can read that the reform was called endless purification. Every year, the Senate introduced new articles for excessive luxury, for disregard of the vow of shame, for working on inappropriate days. All this was accompanied by loud speeches about virtue, but in reality, the amount of taxes grew, and the streets remained the same. The woman whose victory caused a chain reaction disappeared from the documents. She probably left the city. Historians suggest that she may have gone to the port of Ostia or to the south, where control was weaker. Her name was no longer mentioned in official scrolls, but the system created because of her continued to exist. Her shadow stood behind every new decree on morals. Legends spread among the common people. Some said she became a priestess in the temple of Isis. Others said she had gone to the merchants and opened a shop selling incense, but for the lawyer who remained in Rome, everything was different. He saw how her story was used as an example that even a sinner can obtain justice if she obeys the rules. Thus, victory was turned into a lesson in obedience. A few years later, the Senate revised the rates again. Under the pretext of war and lack of funds, they raised the rates by almost a quarter. This time, there were no protests. The city had grown accustomed to the idea that morality and money were inseparable. Roman schools now taught that tax was a form of purification, and that paying it meant serving society. The myth of morality above all else gave way to another. Shame can feed the empire. Under this slogan, new baths and markets were built, decorated with signs reading, "Erected with funds from the Moral Fund." People bathed in pools lined with marble, obtained from the fines of those who were called immoral. A lawyer, who had grown old in his house on the Aventine Hill, kept a copy of that very scroll from the archives of Juno Moneta. He no longer appeared in court, but sometimes gave lectures to young clerics. In one of his notes he wrote, "In Rome, law and shame have shared a bed, and since then, only new taxes have been born." These words were preserved in a list of his notes, found by archaeologists centuries later. Over time, the vectigal system spread to the provinces. In cities in Asia and Africa, officials copied the Roman experience, creating registers of women and men engaged in shameful trades. For the treasury, it was a convenient source of stable income. No one asked who came up with the first complaint and why. When historians later summed up the era, they saw only dry figures: budget growth, a decrease in street conflicts, an increase in temple revenues. In official chronicles, this was called strengthening of morals. No one wrote about fear, humiliation, night raids, and arson. All this was considered side effects of order. When Rome's tax system spread to the provinces, the idea that morality was a private matter disappeared along with it. Now it became a subject of accounting and control. In Egypt, Gaul, and Syria, officials copied Roman records but adapted them to local customs. Where sacred priestesses had previously existed, categories of permissible services were now introduced. Tables of contributions appeared in every major port, and they all contained words of Latin origin: vectigal, poena, licentia. In Alexandria, the tax was levied every 6 months, and every woman registered as working under contract underwent a mandatory examination by a doctor employed by the city administration. This was presented as concern for the health of citizens, but in reality served as a tool of surveillance. Medical records noted age, appearance, and physical condition, after which the data was transferred to a registry. Those who refused to undergo the procedure had their licenses revoked and were considered outlaws. Thus, under the guise of medicine, the first system of biological control over morality appeared. In Carthage, officials went even further. They divided the tax into 2 levels, imperial and local. The first part went to Rome, the second remained with the municipality. The city guard was given the right to conduct random checks of houses where women without a patron may reside. Anyone found without proof of payment was considered a tax evader. This opened up new opportunities for extortion. Within a few years, the number of arrests doubled, but so did the treasury's revenues. Local philosophers and scholars tried to object. One of them, a Stoic named Demetrius, wrote that a state that lives off sin cannot be virtuous. His treatise was quickly banned, and the author himself was exiled to an island. In its place, dozens of panegyrics appeared, claiming that the fees strengthen public discipline and protect the purity of civil marriages. Thus, the ideological machine established a new norm. Paying for shame became honorable. At this time, morality in Rome itself turned into a spectacle. During the festivals in honor of Venus, the city magistrate demonstrated cleansed streets, neighborhoods where, according to reports, there were no unregistered women left. In fact, people were simply relocated outside the city to make the statistics look better. Tables with figures of collected taxes were displayed in the square. The public applauded. No one remembered that these same figures had once been evidence of fraud. The myth of double collection gradually dissolved in the rhetoric of the Senate. Now it served as a warning. Anyone who tried to argue with the treasury risked causing turmoil. And yet, in private letters found by archaeologists on Vesuvius, there are fragments of stories. In one of them, a scribe mentions a woman who defeated the tax collector but lost her house. Even decades later, the memory of her still caused concern. In the later years of Claudius's reign, the first treatises on legal prostitution as a form of civic duty appeared in the forums. The authors argued that the body, like property, should benefit the state. These texts were quoted in temples, and priests interpreted them as confirmation of the divine order. Everything that exists has a price. Thus, economic logic penetrated even theology. A new trend took hold among medical professionals: cleanliness and public welfare. Doctors began to describe women's bodies as part of the moral health of the city. Forums discussed statistics rather than diseases. If the number of licensed workers decreased, it was considered a threat to public peace. Fewer taxes, less control, and therefore more chaos. Thus, economics finally replaced ethics. At the same time, the trade in fear grew. Amulets engraved with formulas against punishment were sold in the markets. Townspeople believed that wearing such a talisman could protect them from unfair fines. Some priestesses, for a fee, cleansed women before inspections by pouring water from temple springs over them. In reality, this was simply a new form of tribute. An elderly lawyer observed this from afar. His words, recorded in one of his letters, sound almost prophetic. When tax becomes a form of faith, faith becomes a form of tax. He died without any disciples, and his notes lay gathering dust for a long time. Only a century later were they transcribed by monks, who turned them into instructions on proper treasury management. Meanwhile, in the provinces, the tax on shameful trades became an instrument of colonial control. Local rulers used it to humiliate conquered peoples, forcing them to pay for their own customs. Thus, the Roman model of moral economy became a weapon. Under the slogan of virtue, the empire squeezed taxes out of those who had no voice. In the documents of that era, everything looks orderly. Taxes are stable, income is growing, order is maintained. But behind this apparent harmony lay a society where shame became a unit of measurement, and anyone who tried to prove otherwise disappeared from the records. By the end of the 2nd century, the system, created as an instrument of control, began to decay from within. The empire was falling apart at the seams, the provinces were demanding autonomy, and tax records were turning into piles of useless scrolls. But even then, no one abolished the taxes for debauchery. Too many people were feeding off this mechanism. In Rome, morality was based on calculation, and calculation was based on fear. When Commodus ascended the throne, the city was already living in a state of ostentatious piety. Temples organized mass purifications, demanding payment, not in silver, but in kind, supplies of wine, oil, and clothing. These offerings were redistributed among officials. Under the guise of atoning for sins, a banal inventory of bodies and property took place. At every level of society, its own forms of contribution arose. Women paid a tax for labor, men for inaction, temples for the right to preach. Everything had a price. Moral raids were replaced by propaganda campaigns. Slogans were written on the walls of forums. Cleanliness is the key to order. Shame is a virtue paid for with gold. People no longer perceived this as a threat, but rather as everyday advertising. Even children knew that if a family did not have a receipt for a sacrifice, the guards could enter without permission. In the provinces, the system began to fragment. City elders followed Rome's example, but used the tax not for the treasury, but for local authorities. In Corinth and Ephesus, the fees went to repair roads, and in Antioch, to festivals dedicated to Jupiter. The same thing happened everywhere. Purification of morals became the financing of urban life. Thus, morality was finally transformed into accounting. At the turn of the 3rd century, the first signs of fatigue appeared. Doctors who had served for a long time on moral commissions began to leave, no longer willing to sign fictitious reports. People increasingly forged licenses, and officials sold fake seals. At the Subura market, one could buy a fake scroll, granting the right to live without inspection. The state lost control over its own instrument. At this time, Christianity was growing stronger in Rome. Its preachers called the tax the sin of the empire and claimed that true purity could not be bought. But even they used the language of the treasury, speaking of debt to the soul and payment for sin. The old words did not disappear, they simply changed address. The authorities looked on indifferently. As long as people pay, order is maintained. The chronicles of the late empire hardly mention those who worked under licenses. They were replaced by the terms unclean and repentant. But the logic remained the same: pay for the right to be forgiven. After the fall of Rome, many barbarian kingdoms adopted this principle. In Gaul and Italy, it became known as poenitentia taxatio, the tax of repentance. Now the money went not to the treasury, but to the church. Priests wrote in their reports that in this way they were healing sin with gold. Thus, the circle was complete. State control turned into spiritual control, and the treasury turned into an altar. The woman who once proved the illegality of double taxation remained nameless, but her story lived on in a distorted form. Medieval chroniclers did not mention a freedwoman, but a widow who paid double tax to avoid shame. The legend turned the essence upside down. Protest was turned into a parable of humility. Archaeologists found a later copy of that case, a clay tablet with a remarkable line next to the tax figures. Vectigul duplex remissum ob injuriam, double tax cancelled due to injustice. This is the only evidence where the word injustice is used in an official document of that era. Everything else is dry reports. Over time, the tax itself lost its significance. The empire was collapsing. Gold was in short supply, and moral funds were becoming a fiction. But the idea outlived the state. Each new regime, Byzantine, papal, royal, tried to reproduce this mechanism, dressing it up in new words: indulgence, donation, payment for grace. They all stem from the same logic that was born on the streets of Subura. The lawyers, scribes, and collectors had long since passed away, but their invention survived the centuries. It absorbed all the contradictions of Rome: contempt for the body, greed for power, and the ability to turn shame into income. Historians argue about who was to blame, the officials or the system itself. But perhaps the blame was collective. In a society where fear of shame is valued above justice, any evil becomes a habit. When, thousands of years later, archaeologists excavated the archive on the Esquiline Hill, they found hundreds of tablets with tax records, but not a single name except for official signatures. Everything human had disappeared, leaving only numbers. This was the ultimate irony. Rome, so proud of its morality, was unable to preserve the memory of those who paid for it. And the myth of morality above all else remained a convenient smokescreen for the budget. In reality, there was always another formula behind it. Everything that can be counted can be sold. And as long as someone was willing to pay for the condemnation of others, the empire lived on,